Lucas never considered himself the type to lose control. But that night at the company party proved otherwise. The annual celebration was meant to be a casual get-together, a way to unwind after months of stressful deadlines and long meetings. The bar was stocked, music played in the background, and laughter filled the air as colleagues let loose for the first time in months. Somehow, Lucas found himself at the bar more often than he planned. Drink after drink placed in his hand by enthusiastic coworkers. He wasn't much of a drinker, but the warm buzz in his chest made him feel light, almost carefree. Across the room, Adrian was in his usual charismatic form, laughing loudly, effortlessly charming their colleagues, and somehow managing to drink twice as much as Lucas without looking the slightest bit affected. Their rivalry was well known in the office. If there was a project, they competed to outshine each other. If there was a meeting, they clashed over ideas. It was a constant battle, but one that Lucas secretly enjoyed, even if he'd never admit it. At some point in the night, things blurred together. One moment, he and Adrian were standing outside on the rooftop patio, the cool air sobering him slightly. The next moment, Adrian leaned in closer, his voice teasing, his smirk undeniable. "Didn't think you could keep up with me. Huh?" Lucas rolled his eyes, about to fire back with a snarky remark, when suddenly, Adrian was closer. Much closer. The space between them vanished. And before Lucas could process what was happening, their lips touched. It was brief, clumsy, barely a kiss at all, but enough to send a jolt of awareness through Lucas's alcohol-clouded mind. Then, just as quickly as it happened, Adrian pulled away, blinking as if he too was trying to figure out what had just occurred. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. "Well," Adrian finally said, voice oddly amused. "That's new." Lucas didn't respond. His heart pounded. His mind scrambled for an explanation. But the alcohol dulled his thoughts. The only thing he could do was mumble something incoherent and stumble back into the party, leaving Adrian behind with an unreadable expression. The next morning, Lucas woke up with a splitting headache, and a memory he wasn't sure was real. Lucas groaned as he rolled over in bed, his head throbbing with the weight of last night's choices. The sharp morning light streaming through his window only made it worse. And as he rubbed his temples, flashes of the evening before flickered through his mind. The music, the drinks, the rooftop, and then his eyes snapped open. Adrian. The kiss. Lucas sat up so fast he nearly made himself dizzy. His heart pounded against his ribs. Not from the hangover, but from the memory that had just crashed into him like a freight train. Had it really happened? Had he really kissed Adrian? Or worse, had Adrian kissed him? He squeezed his eyes shut, willing the memory to disappear. But it refused to fade. The brief, accidental brush of lips, the heat between them, the stunned silence that followed. "This is bad," Lucas muttered to himself. His phone buzzed on his nightstand, and with a deep breath, he reached for it, already dreading what he might see. A dozen notifications filled the screen, messages from coworkers, a few blurry photos from the party, and a text from Adrian. Lucas's stomach twisted as he opened it. "Adrian. How's the hangover?" Lucas stared at the screen, fingers hovering over the keyboard. That was it? No mention of what had happened? No sarcastic remark? No teasing? Maybe Adrian didn't remember. Maybe it had been nothing to him. Lucas wasn't sure if that thought made him relieved or disappointed. With a sigh, he tossed the phone aside and dragged himself out of bed, heading for the shower in an attempt to wash away both his headache and the lingering confusion swirling in his chest. By the time he arrived at the office, he had convinced himself that he would act normal, that the night before was a mistake, one fueled by alcohol and bad decisions. He just had to focus on work and pretend it never happened. But the moment he stepped into the office, his confidence wavered. Adrian was already there, leaning casually against his desk, chatting with a coworker. He looked entirely at ease, like he hadn't spent the night making Lucas question everything he knew about himself. Lucas debated turning around and walking right back out the door. But it was too late. Adrian's gaze flickered toward him, and the slightest smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. Lucas's stomach flipped. "Morning, sunshine," Adrian greeted, voice smooth and amused. "Surprised you made it in. You looked pretty out of it last night." Lucas forced a scoff, dropping his bag onto his chair as he avoided Adrian's gaze. "Yeah, well, some of us have responsibilities." Adrian chuckled. "Right, responsibilities. Like running away from rooftop conversations?" Lucas's fingers clenched around the strap of his bag. He swallowed hard. "I don't know what you're talking about." Adrian tilted his head, watching him with far too much amusement. "Don't you?" Lucas felt his pulse in his throat. The way Adrian was looking at him, like he knew exactly how off balance Lucas felt, was infuriating. He refused to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. "Doesn't matter," Lucas muttered, finally forcing himself to meet Adrian's gaze. "It was nothing." For a split second, something unreadable flickered across Adrian's face. But just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, replaced with his usual teasing smirk. "If you say so." Lucas hated how that response unsettled him. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings, emails, and forced normalcy. Every time he found himself near Adrian, he could feel his presence like an undeniable weight pressing against him. It was maddening. By the time lunch rolled around, Lucas had had enough. He needed air, needed space. But just as he was about to step outside, a voice stopped him. "Hey!" Lucas turned, and there was Adrian, standing closer than necessary. "What do you want?" Lucas sighed. Adrian hesitated for just a second, just long enough for Lucas to notice. And then, in a tone quieter than usual, he said, "I remember everything." Lucas's breath hitched. Adrian didn't smirk this time. Didn't tease. Just held Lucas's gaze, waiting. Lucas didn't know whether to run or stay. Lucas could feel his pulse hammering in his ears. Adrian's words, "I remember everything," lingered in the space between them. Heavy and impossible to ignore. The usual teasing lilt in Adrian's voice was gone, replaced with something quieter, something more serious. Lucas swallowed hard. "And?" Adrian studied him for a moment, arms crossed over his chest. The easy smirk he usually wore was absent. And for the first time, Lucas couldn't read him. "I don't know," Adrian admitted. "I just thought we should talk about it." Lucas scoffed, the sound more forced than he would have liked. "There's nothing to talk about. It was a mistake." Adrian's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "A mistake?" "Yes." Lucas forced himself to hold Adrian's gaze. "We were drunk. It didn't mean anything." Adrian didn't respond right away. And that silence only made Lucas more uncomfortable. Finally, Adrian let out a slow breath and shook his head. "Okay," he said, "if that's what you want to believe." Lucas frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," Adrian said, taking a step closer, "that I remember everything. And I remember you didn't pull away." Lucas felt his stomach drop. His mind raced back to that moment, the rooftop. The way the city lights had blurred behind Adrian. The warmth of his breath so close. He could still feel it if he let himself. But he couldn't. He wouldn't. "It doesn't matter," Lucas said quickly. "It was just a mistake," Adrian finished for him, his voice quieter this time. "Right." Lucas didn't know why that word, mistake, sounded so wrong coming from Adrian's mouth. But it did. He wanted this conversation to be over. He wanted to push past Adrian. To go back to his desk. To pretend none of this had ever happened. But instead, he found himself standing there. Heart pounding. Unable to move. Adrian studied him for a moment longer before shaking his head with a quiet chuckle. One that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're a terrible liar. You know." Lucas's jaw clenched. "Drop it, Adrian." Adrian held up his hands in surrender. "Fine. Consider it dropped." But the way he said it told Lucas that Adrian didn't believe him. And, worse, Lucas wasn't sure he believed himself either. The next few days passed in a blur of awkward avoidance. Lucas threw himself into work, keeping his head down, pretending everything was fine. But it wasn't fine. Because every time Adrian walked into the room, Lucas could feel him there. It was ridiculous. He had known Adrian for years. Worked beside him for just as long. Yet somehow, everything felt different now. And Adrian? Adrian seemed completely unbothered. He laughed and joked with coworkers as if nothing had changed. He sent Lucas emails with his usual sarcastic quips. He even stole the last donut from the break room, grinning as he took an exaggerated bite just to annoy him. It was infuriating. And yet, it was relieving too. Because if Adrian could act normal, then so could he, right? But then came Friday night. The office happy hour. Lucas had almost skipped it. He should have skipped it, but he told himself that staying home would only make it weirder. So he went. And that was his first mistake. The bar was loud, filled with coworkers unwinding after a long week. Lucas stuck to the edge of the group, nursing his drink, trying to pretend he wasn't hyper-aware of Adrian across the room. But of course, Adrian found him anyway. "Didn't think you'd show," Adrian said, sliding into the empty seat beside him. Lucas took a slow sip of his drink. "I almost didn't." Adrian smirked. "Afraid of me?" Lucas rolled his eyes. "Hardly." Adrian leaned in slightly, voice dropping just enough to make Lucas tense. "Then why have you been avoiding me?" Lucas opened his mouth, ready with some dismissive excuse. But Adrian just raised a brow, waiting. And suddenly, Lucas was tired. Tired of pretending. Tired of running in circles. Tired of the way his heart wouldn't slow down when Adrian looked at him like that. So, before he could talk himself out of it, he muttered, "You kissed me first." Adrian blinked. For a second, he looked genuinely surprised. Then, slowly, he grinned. "I did," he admitted. "And?" Lucas swallowed. "And, I don't know what to do with that." Adrian's grin softened. "You don't have to do anything." Lucas let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Then why does it feel like everything's changed?" Adrian was quiet for a moment before saying, "Because maybe it has." Lucas looked at him then, really looked at him. And for the first time since that night, he let himself wonder if maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. Lucas wasn't sure how long he sat there, staring at Adrian, trying to process what he had just said. Because maybe it has. It was such a simple statement. Yet it carried a weight that pressed against Lucas's chest, making it hard to breathe. He started, then stopped, because he didn't know what he was supposed to say. Adrian didn't push. He just sat there, watching him with that maddening mix of patience and amusement. Like he knew Lucas was struggling and was enjoying it just a little too much. That was the problem with Adrian. He was too good at reading him. Too good at knowing exactly when to push and when to wait. And right now, he was waiting. Lucas exhaled sharply and ran a hand through his hair. "I don't know what you want from me." Adrian leaned back slightly, tilting his head. "Maybe nothing." Lucas shot him a skeptical look. "You don't do things for nothing." Adrian smirked. "You do know me well." Then, with a shrug, he added, "But maybe I just wanted to see what you'd do if I told the truth." Lucas blinked. "The truth?" Adrian's expression softened, just slightly. "Yeah, that maybe it did mean something." Lucas's stomach twisted. He had spent the past week convincing himself that it hadn't meant anything. That it was just a drunken mistake. An error in judgment. Something to be buried and forgotten. But hearing Adrian say the opposite, so casually, so easily, made that excuse feel flimsier than ever. He swallowed. "That's scary?" Adrian guessed. Lucas's lips pressed into a thin line. "Complicated." Adrian chuckled, shaking his head. "It's only complicated because you make it complicated." Lucas frowned. "That's not fair, isn't it?" Adrian challenged. "Look, I'm not saying we need to put a label on anything. I'm just saying, stop running from it." Lucas opened his mouth, ready to argue, ready to deny everything. But then Adrian leaned in just enough for Lucas to catch the faintest scent of his cologne, fresh, clean, annoyingly familiar. And suddenly, Lucas realized how close they were. How easy it would be to close the distance. How much he wanted to. His pulse jumped, and Adrian must have noticed. Because his smirk returned, just a little. But then, just as quickly as he had leaned in, Adrian pulled back, stretching lazily as if he hadn't just thrown Lucas's entire world off balance. "Anyway," he said, standing up, "I'll leave you to your existential crisis." Lucas glared. "You're insufferable." Adrian grinned. "And yet, you still like me." Lucas opened his mouth to protest. But Adrian was already turning away, disappearing into the crowd of coworkers before he could get a word out. And Lucas? Lucas just sat there, staring at his drink, heart still pounding, and wondering if maybe, just maybe, Adrian was right. After that night, everything did change. Lucas didn't want to admit it, but there was no denying it. Because now, every glance, every accidental touch, every off-handed comment between them meant something. Or at least, Lucas was aware of it. The tension was there, undeniable and unrelenting. But what frustrated Lucas the most was Adrian's reaction to it. Because if Adrian was affected, he sure as hell wasn't showing it. He still acted the same, still teased Lucas mercilessly. Still stole his coffee when he wasn't looking. Still threw wadded-up paper at him during meetings like an overgrown child. But there was a new edge to it all now. A subtle shift. Like Adrian knew something Lucas didn't. Or, more accurately, like Adrian was waiting for Lucas to figure it out. And the worst part? Lucas wasn't sure how much longer he could keep pretending he hadn't already started to. One evening, as they were the last two in the office, Lucas finally broke. "You're doing this on purpose," he accused, crossing his arms. Adrian barely looked up from his laptop. "Doing what?" Lucas scowled. "This. Acting like nothing's changed." Adrian's lips twitched, like he was fighting a smile. "But has anything changed?" Lucas exhaled sharply. "You know it has." Adrian finally closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair, studying him. "Then maybe," he said, voice quieter now, "you should stop fighting it." Lucas clenched his jaw. "And do what, exactly?" Adrian tilted his head. "What do you want to do?" Lucas's heart pounded. The answer was right there, at the tip of his tongue. But saying it, admitting it, felt like stepping off the edge of a cliff. Adrian must have seen the hesitation in his eyes because he pushed back his chair and stood up, stepping closer until there was barely any space between them. Lucas held his breath. And then, Adrian simply said, "When you figure it out, let me know." And with that, he grabbed his bag, gave Lucas one last lingering look, and walked out of the office, leaving Lucas standing there, pulse racing, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on him. Lucas exhaled sharply. Damn him. Lucas spent the rest of the night pacing his apartment, replaying the conversation over and over in his mind. "When you figure it out, let me know." It had been hours since Adrian left the office, but the words still lingered like an unanswered question, like a challenge Lucas wasn't sure he was ready to accept. The worst part? He already had the answer. He just didn't know if he was ready to say it out loud. By the time morning arrived, Lucas had barely slept. He showed up to work groggy, distracted, and maybe just a little irritated at how easily Adrian had gotten under his skin. And of course, Adrian noticed. "Rough night?" Adrian asked, leaning against Lucas's desk with a knowing smirk. Lucas shot him a glare. "Drop it." Adrian raised his hands in mock innocence. "Drop what?" "You know what," Lucas muttered, rubbing his temples. Adrian just chuckled. "If it helps, I was thinking about you too." Lucas nearly choked on his coffee. Adrian grinned, clearly pleased with himself. "See? You make this too easy." Lucas took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "Are you ever serious?" Adrian tilted his head, considering. "With most people? No. With you? Sometimes." Lucas hated the way his stomach flipped at that. And the way Adrian was looking at him now, like he was waiting. Like he was daring Lucas to do something about the tension between them, wasn't helping. Lucas swallowed hard. "I have a meeting to prep for." Adrian sighed dramatically. Fine, but don't think this conversation is over." Lucas didn't respond, just turned back to his computer, pretending to focus even as his thoughts continued to spiral. Because the truth was, no matter how much he tried to ignore it, there was no escaping the fact that Adrian had crossed a line. And the real question now was whether Lucas was willing to cross it too. It happened 2 nights later. Lucas wasn't sure what possessed him to do it. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was frustration. Or maybe he was just done pretending. But when he found himself standing outside Adrian's apartment at 10 p.m., heart pounding, hands clenched into fists at his sides, He knew there was no turning back. He knocked once, then twice, and then the door swung open, revealing Adrian, barefoot, hair slightly messy, dressed in a plain t-shirt and sweatpants. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Adrian smirked. "Knew you'd show up." Lucas rolled his eyes. "You're insufferable. And yet, here you are," Adrian pointed out, stepping aside to let him in. Lucas hesitated for only a moment before walking past him, into the dimly lit apartment. Adrian closed the door behind him. "So, what finally did it?" Lucas turned to face him. "Did what?" Adrian raised an eyebrow. "Made you stop running." Lucas clenched his jaw. "I never said. You didn't have to." Adrian interrupted, stepping closer. "You're here." Lucas swallowed hard, heart hammering against his ribs. Because Adrian was right. He was here. And maybe, just maybe, he didn't want to run anymore. Adrian watched him carefully, waiting. Lucas took a shaky breath. Whatever this is between us, it's going to complicate everything." Adrian nodded slowly. "Probably." Lucas exhaled. "And you don't care?" Adrian smiled. But this time, there was no teasing, no smirk, just quiet certainty. Not even a little. And that was all it took. Because the next thing Lucas knew, he was closing the distance, grabbing Adrian by the front of his shirt, and kissing him like his life depended on it. And maybe, in a way, it did. The next morning, Lucas woke up to the soft glow of sunlight filtering through Adrian's bedroom window. For a moment, he just lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. He had crossed the line. There was no taking it back now. A quiet sigh from beside him made him turn his head. Adrian was still asleep, his dark hair a mess, his breathing slow and steady. He looked peaceful, completely unbothered by the fact that their entire dynamic had just shifted overnight. Lucas, on the other hand, felt like his entire world had been flipped upside down. He carefully slipped out of bed, grabbing his clothes from the floor. He needed a moment to think, to process. He wasn't the kind of guy who did things without a plan. And last night? Last night had been anything but planned. Before he could make it to the door, Adrian's voice, still rough from sleep, broke the silence. "Running already?" Lucas froze. Adrian was propped up on one elbow, watching him with an expression that was way too knowing for this early in the morning. "I have work," Lucas muttered, avoiding his gaze as he buttoned up his shirt. "Right," Adrian said, stretching lazily, because nothing says casual and unbothered like sneaking out before breakfast. Lucas sighed, rubbing his temples. "Adrian, relax." Adrian interrupted, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. "I knew this was going to freak you out. I just didn't think you'd bolt before coffee." Lucas finally looked at him. "I'm not bolting." Adrian smirked. "So you're staying?" Lucas opened his mouth, then closed it again. Adrian chuckled. "That's what I thought." He stood up, completely unbothered by the fact that he was still in just his sweatpants, and made his way to the kitchen. "Coffee?" Lucas hesitated. His instinct was to leave, to put as much distance as possible between himself and the chaos of whatever this was turning into. But instead, he found himself sighing in defeat. "Yeah, coffee sounds good." Adrian shot him a victorious grin. "See? That wasn't so hard." Lucas rolled his eyes. But as he sat down at the kitchen table and watched Adrian move around the kitchen like they'd done this 100 times before, he realized something unsettling. Being here with Adrian, letting himself have this moment, felt dangerously close to normal. And that was the scariest part of all. By the time Lucas got to the office, his nerves were shot. He had convinced himself that last night had been a one-time thing, a lapse in judgment. But as soon as he walked in, Adrian was already waiting at his desk, coffee in hand, looking like he hadn't just turned Lucas's world inside out. Lucas froze. "What are you doing?" Adrian grinned, handing him the cup. "Bringing you coffee. Like a good colleague." Lucas shot him a look. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" Adrian shrugged. "A little." Lucas sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "We need to be careful." "Careful?" Adrian repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Lucas, we're not spies. We're two consenting adults who work together." Lucas cut in. "Which means this, us? It's complicated." Adrian studied him for a long moment. "Okay," he said slowly. "So what's the plan?" Lucas hesitated. He wanted to say they should forget it ever happened, that they should go back to normal. But the problem was, he didn't want to forget. And judging by the look on Adrian's face, neither did he. Lucas exhaled. "The plan is to take things one step at a time." Adrian smiled. "I can work with that." And just like that, Lucas realized something terrifying. He was already in too deep. Life often unfolds in ways we least expect. No matter how much we try to control our circumstances, there are moments when emotions, relationships, and unexpected choices disrupt our carefully laid plans. The story of Lucas and Adrian serves as a reminder that sometimes the most meaningful connections arise from the least expected situations. One key lesson is the importance of embracing uncertainty. Instead of fearing change or resisting emotions, we should allow ourselves the freedom to explore, adapt, and grow. Relationships, whether romantic, professional, or platonic, thrive on honesty and understanding. Avoiding difficult conversations or running from emotions only prolongs inner conflict. Another vital message is that happiness often lies outside our comfort zones. While structure and discipline are essential, life's most profound moments come from taking chances and being vulnerable. Lucas struggled with control, yet his growth began when he allowed himself to be open to change. For an older audience, this story reinforces a timeless truth. Life is not just about predictability or control, but about the courage to embrace the unexpected, cherish meaningful connections, and find joy in the journey rather than just the destination.